Our next speaker is Jeremy Lent from San Rafael, California. The title of his talk is The Tyranny of the Prefrontal Cortex.
Hi. And I'd like to ask you all to consider the following facts about the current state of our world. Our civilization is changing the climate of our planet. People kill themselves and others in the name of God. Species are going extinct at a rate not seen for 65 million years. 1 billion people go hungry every day. We make astonishing advances in technology, yet our world is careening ever faster out of control. And meanwhile, people everywhere are searching for spiritual meaning to their lives. What connects these seemingly unrelated phenomena? I'm proposing in this presentation that there is an overriding dynamic driving all these global imbalances. It's so fundamental to our lives that we don't even realize it exists. It's what I call the tyranny of the prefrontal cortex over other aspects of our consciousness. And I've come to believe that acknowledging this tyranny is the first step towards reharmonizing our individual and collective consciousness. In this presentation, you'll see what may be called a cognitive history of humanity. That's a view of human history interpreted from a cognitive perspective. It understands humanity's evolving stages of cultural thought in terms of the prefrontal cortex, or PFC's, ever-increasing power over human consciousness. It identifies certain human cognitive universals emerging in prehistory, and then looks at some cultural-specific cognitive divergences happening in the past 2,500 years. The presentation will be in three parts. First, we'll look at what I mean by the tyranny of the PFC. Then we'll examine how it came about. And finally, we'll take a look at what it means. What are its implications for us and our future? So first, let's just spend a moment on the PFC itself. It's located at the very front of the brain in what's known as the cerebral cortex. It's far more developed in humans than in other animals. And it mediates those parts of our cognition that are uniquely human, such as symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, making rules, and creating abstractions. It also is responsible for controlling our physiological drives, for imposing meaning on things, and for allowing us to conceive of a past and a future, and to see ourselves and others as independent agents. Because of the prefrontal cortex, humans are unique in having dual forms of consciousness. A conceptual consciousness, all that stuff mediated by the PFC, and an animate consciousness, that part of our lived experience that we share with other mammals, such as hunger, sexual urges, pain, fear, aggression, desire for warmth, and caring for our offspring. But over the past few thousand years, changes in culture have caused a shift in the balance between these two forms of consciousness, so that it began to look more like this, where conceptual consciousness is elevated over animate consciousness. We think of those PFC-mediated faculties like reason, abstraction, willpower, and transcendence as higher qualities, while those animate functions like primary emotions, instincts, and sexual drive have been relegated to baser instincts. Now, this shift happened over a number of stages in human history, and they were punctuated with some key inflection points that I'll show you in this chart. You'll see the time on the horizontal axis is measured in a logarithmic scale, And on the vertical axis, we'll look at the increasing levels of PFC domination over the rest of human consciousness. So the first inflection point occurred with the evolution of Homo sapiens around 250,000 years ago, with the beginnings of a primitive form of language. Then, around 50,000 years ago, we see some stirrings of the PFC's power with the first cave paintings. It was about 10,000 years ago that the PFC began its ascendancy to power with the rise of agriculture. And then, around 2,000 years ago, a dramatic split took place between the trajectory of Western civilization following the radically dualistic thought of the ancient Greeks and the rest of the world. This divergence became even more pronounced after the scientific revolution, which began in Europe in the 17th century. Now, I'm going to take you through each of these stages in a little more detail, beginning with that ground zero for the PFC's power with the evolution of modern Homo sapiens. Now, over the past few decades, anthropologists and archaeologists have begun to recognize the central role of the PFC in human evolution. They've come to realize that the PFC first developed its unique powers as the engine of our social brain that we needed to get ahead in increasingly large and complex groups. We developed what's known as theory of mind, the ability to infer the mental states of others, to see others as having agency, just like we do. And we developed a narrative self-awareness, the ability to see our past and even our future as a story. The unique connectivity of the PFC allowed us to combine skills from separate domains into an integrated, fluid cognition, leading to the use of symbols, and ultimately, through weaving a net of symbols together, to language. Then, around 50,000 years ago, a revolution in symbolic thought occurred. Our ancestors began using complex tools, music, sewing, ceramic kilns, and engaging in long-distance trade. And they left behind haunting examples of their art on cave walls throughout Europe. Their PFC's patterning instinct was trying to make sense of the world around them, leading to the rise of a mythic consciousness. A key element in this was anthropomorphism, which we can understand as and implicitly using that theory of mind and applying it to other non-humans, such as other animals or inanimate objects. Around the world, in hunter-gatherer cultures, shamanism developed, with a key belief that a person's PFC is separate from their body, that it can leave their body as a spirit and then return again. Then, around 10,000 years ago, people began to realize that through the power of their PFC, they could exercise some control over the plants and animals around them, and agriculture emerged. Along with it came notions of property and land ownership, hierarchies, and inequalities. We begin to see emergence of specialized skills, such as writing and craftsmanship. That, by the way, is one of the earliest examples of writing from Mesopotamia. And we see massive organized projects occurring, such as irrigation and temples, and large complex societies with cities and empires. Then, around 500 BC, in ancient Greece, an idea appeared for the first time in human history that there is an abstract and eternal dimension of the universe, which is the ultimate source of value and meaning. And imprisoned in the human body, an immortal soul exists, which through the power of the reason and abstraction of the PFC connects us with this eternal value and meaning. So, remembering our dual human consciousness from before, what the ancient Greeks did was to equate conceptual consciousness with the soul and animate consciousness with the body. And only the soul is connected with the transcendent meaning of the universe, while the body becomes just another part of the material world. This was the PFC's coup, to see itself as the source of the immortal soul, as the connection with the eternal dimension of the universe. This idea became conflated with the unique form of monotheism arising out of the Middle East to create the ultimate coup, with the rise of Christianity, the first systematic, dualistic cosmology. Then, in the 17th century in Europe, a scientific revolution erupted to create our modern world. With Descartes, the dualism of the Greeks was transformed into our modern mind-body dualism. Reductionism became the basis for scientific inquiry, and the natural world was seen as a resource for human conquest and domination. In the words of that great prophet of the scientific age, Francis Bacon, we could unite forces against the nature of things to extend the bounds of human empire, establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe, and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And we succeeded beyond Bacon's wildest dreams. Here is just one of countless examples of our dramatic success, a graph showing the accuracy of time measurement over history. You'll see that around the time when Bacon lived, Western European clocks could be off by as much as a minute a day and were less accurate than Chinese clocks. Then it all began improving exponentially, so that now we're off by less than 100 millionth of a second a day. This dramatic transformation of technology led to another exponential curve, the rise in the world population of humans, which leads to other, more disturbing exponential curves, such as the unsustainable level of carbon dioxide we're putting out into the atmosphere, causing global climate change. So, how did the PFC's rise get so exponential? The answer lies in the ratcheting effect of culture. If we go back in time to the evolution of early humans, we see that the PFC's evolving patterning instinct led to early symbolic thought, which encouraged increased PFC usage among those early humans, leading eventually to the emergence of language, which caused each individual's PFC to become more networked, both within the brain and with other PFCs in the community, leading to that fixed and powerful network of symbols that comprise a culture, which we can think of as an external PFC. As that external PFC became more complex, it leveraged each individual PFC from infancy to learn how to dominate the animate consciousness within and the natural world without, leading to the ever-increasing exponential impact of technology and our present dynamic. Now, I see our PFC-powered human takeoff as something like a satellite that's been launched with wobbly controls, which can lead to one of only 3 scenarios. We could leave the Earth behind, which some people talk about in terms of the so-called singularity, the moment when computers become even more intelligent than humans. Essentially, the PFC evolving itself completely away from its human origins. Or, and what many people see as more likely, we could crash and burn as we relentlessly use the Earth's dwindling resources to fuel our exponential growth. Or we could somehow find ourselves in a stable, sustainable orbit. Now, I suspect that most of you, just like me, would prefer this scenario. But how do we get there? Sustainability requires a new inflection point to a PFC-5. But what would that stage of human development look like in terms of the PFC's relation to the rest of human consciousness? How do we get from a tyranny to a democracy of consciousness? A PFC-5 worldview needs to restore integration to the separations of our PFC-4 worldview. Separations within the self, separations in our cosmos, and separations between ourselves and the universe. Now, the spiritual traditions of Asia offer techniques to reduce this PFC tyranny. Zen koans bypass the reasoning mechanism. Buddhism questions the PFC's fixed notion of self. Meditation quiets the PFC's incessant patterning drive. And Taoist Wu Wei offers a mode of non-purposive, non-goal-oriented actions. But it's in modern science that we can find hints of a true PFC-5 worldview. Findings in systems biology and complexity science invalidate that PFC-4 reductionist cosmology. We learn that all living entities are complex, self-organized, dynamical systems. That interactions between things are more important than the things themselves. That no system is autonomous, but continually interacting with other systems. There are no fixed equilibria, only continually shifting states of relative stability, leading to occasional phase transitions and the emergence of new forms of complexity. In a PFC-5 worldview, the explanatory principle of life is not mechanical reductionism, but self-organization and emergence. The relation between the material and spiritual is defined not by dualism, but by integrated dynamics. And the source of spiritual value and meaning is not transcendence, but the dynamic connectivity between all living things. So the human relationship to the natural world goes from being one of domination to one of guidance, sustainability, and mutual support. And what the natural world means to us is no longer a resource to utilize, but a source of material and spiritual nourishment. So the self goes from being seen as a separate, fixed, autonomous entity to something connected, fluid, and interactive. And the PFC goes from being a tyrant in consciousness to becoming a conductor, an observer, a guide. It all begins with recognizing the tyranny of the PFC in our current worldview and the intention to move towards that democracy of consciousness. So when we learn to use our PFC to harmonize ourselves from within, then we can begin to truly harmonize with the world around us. So for anyone interested, I'm writing a book on this subject called Leology, Towards an Integration of Science and Meaning, which goes into more depth on that PFC tyranny and the opportunities of that PFC5 worldview. You can check my progress on these blogs or contact me for more information. Okay, thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Nicely done, thank you. I'm not familiar with any other work that's been done leading to the ideas that you presented about the history of the prefrontal cortex. How much of this is original work of yours, and how much is presenting stuff that we just don't know yet?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I've actually been researching this for about 5 or 6 years, and essentially the only thing that I feel that I've done that is original is connecting different theories, research, and findings of scientific work that's been conducted, scientific, historical, anthropological work that's been conducted. So basically every statement in this presentation actually has a whole slew of rigorous scientific and historical research behind it. I've just really feel the only creative thing I've done is to connect the dots in the way that in this presentation. Yeah, thank you. So that, yeah.
Thank you. Very, very nicely done. I get the, perhaps wrongly, the impression that whenever you mention the singularity, that Kurzweil and the age of spiritual machines and perhaps transhumanism do not, at least for you, give an opportunity to reach that 5th level.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that's an accurate interpretation of when I'm looking at that PFC5 level, I'm seeing that as something very, very different from Kurzweil and the age of spiritual machines. What I see in his vision is exactly that image of the satellite leaving the Earth behind forever. And there is a possible future scenario for our race that we will go in that direction if we don't follow one of those other 2 alternatives. My own feeling about it is that we, as human beings, are both that conceptual and animate consciousness. And for me, speaking personally, and I think for many of us in the world today, to leave that animate consciousness behind for some future that was this pure, digitized conceptual consciousness, to me would be a great tragedy.
Yes, I also like your approach a lot, and I only have a detail which I would like to reflect upon, and that's how you classified shamanism. I'm not a specialist myself, but as far as I know, it's nothing in the way you put it, like getting more into this PFC dominance, but rather the opposite way around. So as far as I know, it's something similar to some Eastern traditions, where you more stimulate the unconscious and the fantasy and so on. So not really as you classified it. That was one point I wanted to mention.
Sure, I understand. Thank you for your point. Yes, because if you look back at that original chart I put, shamanism really is in that, what I call the PFC1 stage, which is really nothing more than the stirrings of power of the PFC. It was a level that human culture evolved, which led to ultimately to this domination of the PFC in our current worldview. But in that stage, shamanism itself really is just the beginnings of an awareness that there is this kind of concept of humanity as and some sort of sense of a spirit existing separately from the body, but not in the way that dualism then emerged many, many thousands of years later. But it's much more a sense, yes, of an animate connectivity with the natural world around us, but trying to make sense of it And that's, and so yeah, so in many ways there is a lot of connection, and in fact shamanism really evolved into those Eastern traditions.
It occurs to me that the problems that we are today facing have much more to do with a change in values. Namely that human values are very much reduced to economic values. So the prefrontal cortex would operate on whatever values there are, are the basis
Right.
of everything. So I would not go and have surgery just because my values are wrong, and I don't. How do you put this? Because values, as far as I've seen, are not really located in the prefrontal cortex.
Sure. And first, let me just clarify one thing. When I talk about the tyranny of the prefrontal cortex, I don't want anybody to get the impression I'm saying something bad about the prefrontal cortex itself. It is the most amazing and evolutionary development in many ways in the whole of the earth. And what I'm talking about is the need to take that incredible power that each of us humans have in that connectivity and apply it in a more harmonious way with both our animate consciousness within ourselves and the rest of the natural world around us. And I completely agree with you about it's the values that I'm talking about. And really, if you remember that ratcheting effective culture slide that I was showing you, what we see is that a culture, such as our modern culture, is really like an external PFC. It's a collection of values that get imposed on each infant. As each infant begins to just learn language and watch TV and learn technology, and at that point learns, as in your point, the economics or material wealth is most important. That is part of that tyranny of the PFC. Values that are put on that emerging child to lead them to view their own animate consciousness and the natural world in a certain way, which has become so destructive. Thank you.
And you seem to put a lot of responsibility on the religion as a leader of the coup in this PFC level 3 or 2.
Mm-hmm.
So, which role do you see to religion in this PFC 5 level?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. What I see is monotheism, as opposed to religion in general, as having been a key driver of that PFC coup, because it was monotheism, this belief in a transcendent meaning above the material world, that then desacralized the material world, which then allowed the scientific way of thinking to say we can do anything we want with that natural world. So that's what I see as a key element in monotheism. My own view is that and as a whole global culture, we have so much to learn from the Eastern spiritual traditions. In particular, I think not just Buddhism, but some of the Chinese traditions, which never went through this great dualistic split that occurred both in India, in fact, and in the Western world. So I think we have a lot to learn from that. But I think what is most important is to bridge this gap that most people still want to see in the modern world between spiritual ideas and science. Most people, the scientists and spiritual thinkers, still continue to think that it's okay to have two different sort of systematic structures that just don't talk to each other. My view is that the only way to reach this PFC5 sustainable mode is to look at the bridges between the two. And they exist, because what we see is when we look at the source of the spiritual, not in transcendence, but in our material dynamic interconnectivity, then we can start to describe that in scientific terms, in complexity theory and systems biology, which are developing ways of understanding just that kind of interconnectivity.
Yeah, I like that you see that there's interconnectivity, but it looks as though, to me, that the connectivity you're seeing is in material form, where it's matter and energy. And it looks like, I mean, there are a lot of experiments showing that there's interconnectivity across space and time, of consciousness affecting matter, and vice versa, in non-ordinary ways. And I think that may act as like the super booster to what you're envisioning.
Yeah, perhaps I think I see your point. And in fact, if we go back to the the debate at the opening of the conference yesterday, between are we all energy on one side or are we just all matter on the other side. To me, what the PFC-5 worldview offers us is an ability to really leave that, really arise through that debate and leave it behind, because what I'm talking about and what systems biology and complexity theory leads us to is a recognition that it's the interactivity of matter that is what's really meaningful. To try to talk about interactivity and our connectivity without looking at matter is just as meaningless as the reductionist view of trying to just look at matter and ignoring the connectivity between things. It's those two together that really create for us both meaning and a scientific understanding.
You probably thought of it or rejected it, but especially with the line of questioning, the final phase of getting back to democracy, and I really like what you're doing with this. I'm teaching a Marx course right now, and I hear Marx in this, we don't want to return to democracy, right? Democracy in sort of the Western liberal form is modeled by individual rights and separation and a lack of connectivity. This sort of Marxist analysis is going to work wonderfully for you, I think. Everything from alienation to the critique of religion, to the value of economics, to the sense of alienation, to the sense of reconnecting the human being with its inorganic body, namely nature in the world. There's amazing connections with sort of Marxism here. Have you thought of that or played with any of that? And also the notion of an Aufhebung, a revolution that retains and yet moves to a new level.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting stuff. I think some of the Marxist dialectical view of history, looking at it as stages in sort of shifts of power, relates quite a lot to the different PFC stages I was talking about there. I have some difficulties with the overall Marxist materialist conception of things, which tends to look very much at the natural world as a resource for whatever stage of human development it's looking at, rather than this kind of PFC-5 level of looking at the whole, our interaction with the natural world as being the source of value. So that's where I sort of part company somewhat with the Marxist interpretation.
I read Marx differently there.
Yeah, and be interested to hear your perspectives on it.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
First of all, I'd like to say this has been my favorite presentation so far, and that I think it was very well organized.
Thank you.
And then just as a question, I was wondering what your ideas are or your thoughts on the global mind and technology / social media in terms of your PFC-5 worldview.
Sure. I think tremendous opportunity. In fact, if you remember the slide I was showing, talking about like the systems view of understanding reality, is all about how phase transitions can lead to emergence to a new level of meaning and understanding. And there are some ways, there are really some possibilities where that whole sort of social media, the interconnectivity essentially between different PFCs globally, can lead to a true an emergence of a new form of global human understanding, which has the potential to be incredibly powerful in taking us to that PFC-5 level. The question is whether it could also take us to some other PFC level too, such as that leaving the Earth behind kind of scenario. So it's a very powerful and probably is going to be a seminal part of where we go as humanity, but it doesn't necessarily lead to that sustainable PFC-5 level. I think it really relies on each of us to do our part to shift it towards that direction. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you very much.